there are ancient cave paintings in a remote location that may provide clues to human settlements from the distant past. Is this crucial evidence being protected by Egyptian authorities?
It's terrible. Terrible. It's priceless. Priceless. Priceless prehistoric evidence. Look here. Look here. What's this, a dog or a gazelle? A man. You see the man here? He's wearing pharaonic clothes. It's terrible. With scribbles all over. I mean, the evidence that we're looking for is being destroyed by irresponsible people coming here. The site is unprotected. And the irony is that people who are responsible are prevented from coming here and driven crazy with licenses and papers.
Many researchers, including Egyptologists themselves, have often been confused and baffled as to how the Egyptian civilization began.
Yes.
Simply because one finds a civilization fully formed, fully mature at its beginning rather than at its end. The pyramids, for example, are of the 4th dynasty. Pyramid building began in the 3rd dynasty. Hardly a few hundred years after the Egyptian civilization is supposed to have started. We find a fully formed religion, a fully formed science, a fully formed astronomy, a fully formed architecture. And it simply didn't satisfy many researchers who simply could not accept that a civilization could start fully formed like that. Now, one of the theories that was quite common until not long ago was that the Egyptian civilization was a kind of offshoot of the Mesopotamian civilization, of the Sumerians.
Yes.
Simply because they had determined that the Sumerian civilization was probably slightly older. This is not the case, as a matter of fact. It has been shown that both civilizations were perhaps of similar date. However, recently, I'm talking like the last 30 years, this theory was slowly falling apart because clearly there was a prehistory to Egypt which was found within Egypt itself. The studies of Egyptian prehistory started perhaps with Flinders Petrie, Sir Flinders Petrie, who found in Upper Egypt, in Hierakonpolis, one of the sites, in Abydos, a evidence of a culture that did not resemble at all the old kingdom of Egypt, where at the time of the pyramid builders, everything was different. The art, the architecture, the burials. And so he at first thought that there had been a completely different race of people that had established themselves in the Nile Valley as well. And this led to the so-called invasion theory, that it was assumed that some people invaded Egypt and settled there. However, slowly they began to realize that this was not the case, and that the evidence that they were finding was in fact Egyptian, but it was prehistoric. And slowly, many scholars began to look more carefully at this. And they concluded that in fact there had been a fairly long period of prehistory predating the foundation of the Egyptian civilization, or rather the dynastic period, as they call it. Now, in the last, the area that I'm focusing on, which is the most promising area, is the Egyptian Sahara. And I should perhaps start properly by telling you that it started rather strangely. It was well known that throughout the Sahara, not just in Egypt, but in Libya and beyond, there is much evidence of a prehistoric culture. This is rather obvious when you travel in the Sahara. You find prehistoric stone tools all over the place. And of course, rock art
You were just mentioning rock art, and then you were cut off.
So the Sahara is filled with evidence of prehistoric people. Now, in 1974, a group of anthropologists, led by the anthropologist from America, Fred Wendorf, who's now retired, and had formed what still is expedition with the Polish Academy of Science. To cut a long story short, what they had discovered is known today as the Nabta Playa ceremonial complex. And carbon dating has dated this site to about 6,000 to 7,000 BC. So it's a very, very ancient site.
So here it was. I mean, people in the deserts, thousands of years before the construction of pyramids, were building strange structures in stone and aligning them to the very stars that later the ancient Egyptians used. And on top of that, they had developed a calendar. So the attributes that we had previously allocated to the ancient Egyptians, such as the calendar, for example, and astronomy, now had to be allocated to a people who were only 100 kilometers away from the Nile and had been doing this for thousands of years before. So that's the big question. The other thing I should add is that the stellar alignments that I've mentioned at Nabta Playa were not only merely pointing to the stars in question, but they seem to have been tracking these stars over vast periods of time. Because, for example, with the alignment of Orion's belt, there are two alignments, one pointing to Orion's belt at a certain date. The earliest date is about 7,000 BC. And then another alignment pointing to about 3,500 BC or so. So it looks like these people were not only there for a very, very long time, but they were actually tracking the stars. And this completely changed the picture of what we imagine prehistoric people to do, because not only Nabta Playa, by the way, is the oldest astronomical site in the world, but here we had what looked like evidence that they were actually following the movement of the stars caused by the precessional displacement. This had never been seen anywhere else on the planet. So, clearly, whoever they were very clever astronomers.
This is really interesting, Robert, and there's two things I want to ask you right away. Does the people here of the Nabta Playa, have them been given a name yet? And maybe you can talk a little bit about, again, this issue of dating. How the heck do you go about dating a site like this?
Well, the anthropologists had no problem dating it because they found various organic materials buried, like the cows, for example. And they could carbon date all this, and they clearly arrived, and convinced themselves, no problem at all, with radiocarbon that we were talking about a site that was at least 7,000 BC, give or take a couple of hundred years. What is interesting is that the carbon dating could be followed throughout the millennia, and the last date that appears at Nabta Playa is about 3,400 BC. Now, this is very interesting because we know that these areas became super arid. They became unlivable because of the lack of water. And the date coincides beautifully with the rise of the Egyptian civilization 100 kilometers away. So when we put two and two together, it would appear that these people from Nabta Playa, when they had to abandon the Sahara, moved to the Nile and took along with them this cargo of knowledge, the knowledge of domestication of cattle, which again seems to be the oldest in the world that we have there, and the knowledge of astronomy, the knowledge of stone building and so forth, and arrived happily in the Nile Valley and injected this knowledge which gave the impetus to the Pharaonic civilization. It's very, very clear, and many anthropologists, in fact many Egyptologists, are now very seriously looking at this. However, who were these people? You're absolutely right. What do we call them?
Yeah.
And that's where it gets very, very interesting. Because at Nabta Playa, they did not find any human remains. And even though it's clear that the people who were there lived there for thousands of years. So it looks like they were using the Nabta Playa as a kind of gathering place to perform these rituals and ceremonies across the millennia. A bit like Stonehenge, if you like, which was not a kind of settlement. Rather, it was a place where people gathered to do their rituals and ceremonies.
Yes.
So where were these people? Well, the first sign was that they found a cemetery, a prehistoric cemetery, about 20 kilometers from Nabta Playa. And clearly, they found some of the bodies of these people. There was about 67 tombs. And what comes out of that is fascinating, because there is no doubt at all from the anthropological analysis that the people were of black African origin.